We are live. Welcome everyone to another Properties and Beers. It's a Friday. Let's have a fun time. If you're noticing a bit of noise outside, I'm actually at the CUB or the Cub headquarters. It's Club of United Business over here in Melbourne. If you don't know what that is, Google it, check it out, and I'll drop my line soon. Now, let's start with the interesting question. Have you noticed something really interesting over the last couple of weeks? The federal budget comes out, the headlines start flying around, and the social media is full of opinions, and everyone's got an opinion, right? Suddenly, a lot of investors who are ready to move forward are back sitting on the fence when wondering whether they should wait. And honestly, one of my favorite sayings is get off the fence. The only thing you'll get there is splinters. And you know what? It doesn't always work where people are ready to get off the fence. And that's one of these times. Maybe you felt it yourself, and maybe you've looked at these changes and negative gearing and discussion around capital gains tax, interest rates, affordability, and thought, should I just wait and see what happens? Well, here's the thing. Tonight, I want to talk about something that I think is much more important than trying to predict what happens next, because investors who do well in the long term, they're not necessarily the ones that make the perfect predictions, because perfection, as Tony Robbins says, is the lowest standard, because it's something that you'll never actually reach. So, in fact, the people who don't wait for perfection, the ones that build the portfolios, they can keep moving forward through different market conditions. And that's what I'm going to unpack a little bit tonight. Look, my name's Gaurav Gupta, CEO and founder of Ethical Property Investments. We help everyday Aussies build high cash flow property portfolios that create real income. They support communities and put investors in a position where the portfolio can continue working even when the conditions aren't ideal. So grab a beer, grab a drink, jump into the comments. Let's get on it. Tonight, I want to talk about three things, right? First, the fear that property could crash. Second, why fundamentals are telling a very different story from the headlines. And third, why waiting for certainty can sometimes be the most expensive decision an investor makes. Now, what are we drinking today? Let's get this party started. We have a Cub Lager. That's right. I'm at Cub. They have their own beer. What legends. Club of United Business Lager. Let's give it a go. Now, I'm not going to lie, so I've had this before. It's quite delicious. Cub Lager, it is made by Hard Road Brewing. It's quite delicious. And so I know it's Friday, had a few drinks already, so let's get this party started. Let's start with this crash conversation. What a positive way to start, Goro. You know what? Because every time uncertainty appears, the conversation comes back. And right now, it's back again, right? It's kind of like Arnie. It's back. Because people are asking whether the budget changes could be the thing that finally caused a major correction. Now, here's the interesting part. Every cycle has a reason why people think the things are different. Every cycle. Let's go back to 2008. The world was crashing, banks were collapsing, financial markets were in chaos, and people genuinely believed the whole system was broken. Property in Australia went down about 8%. The following year, guess what? Went up 13%. Now, let me ask you a question. Would you be really upset if you bought at 8%, crashed 8%, and then went up 13%? You wouldn't be upset. You'd still be up 5%, right? That's literally within 1 year. And let's jump forward to 2020, because, look, that wasn't the last time that happened. Remember the conversations back then, lockdowns, economic uncertainty, predictions everywhere. In Melbourne, property went down early in the year. The year finished roughly at 0.7% growth, even in a market which went sideways. Then 2021 came along, 18.6% growth. Now, I'm not saying property never goes backwards. Of course it does. Market move cycles happen. Different cities act in different ways. What I'm saying is that fear tends to convince us that today's problem is permanent. And that, my friends, is where investors can get themselves into trouble. Because while you're inside the storm, it always feels bigger than it looks in hindsight. Nobody was calling the GFC a buying opportunity when it was happening. Nobody was saying during lockdowns, this is going to recover pretty well. The smart ones, like myself and a few of the other people I was talking to, were looking for purchasing opportunities. In fact, I spoke to a friend in 2020. It's like, you know what? I purchased a property in Brisbane thinking I want to move up there. Didn't move up there, but the property's doubled in value since 2020. And you know what? Let's talk about 2008, the biggest financial crisis we had. I purchased 3 properties that quadrupled in 4 years. Now, that was 2010, by the way, 2 years after the crash. Waited for the market, was clearly underpriced there. I purchased 3 properties in USA that quadrupled in 4 years. Now, that's not saying that that's smart thinking. That's experienced mindset. It's the same mindset that you my friends, will need to succeed in the property game over the next few years. You see, people were scared, and that's normal. Investors today are experiencing something really similar, I'm seeing. The budget arrives, the tax settings are changing, the political landscape is shifting, and people are starting to wonder whether this is the beginning of something much, much bigger. Now, before we jump into conclusions, it is worth asking another question. What actually drives property values in the long run? Because if headlines alone determine property prices, we'd have seen far bigger damage over the years than we actually have, right? You know, one of the reasons I'm a little bit cautious about buying this whole crash narrative is because we're still dealing with a housing shortage. Honestly, it might be presumptuous, but I don't buy any story about a major crash when we have a shortfall of housing. Think about what we're seeing, right? Population growth through the roof, rental demand's going through the roof. We have construction challenges, higher building costs. Supply, my friends, is struggling to keep up. Those factors don't just disappear because a scary headline appears. And you know what? You see, the market can absolutely have periods of weakness, and I want to acknowledge that, right? That supply and demand have a habit of eventually reasserting themselves. And this brings us to something I think is really, really important, because the real question isn't whether there'll be volatility. They'll probably be right at this point in time. The real question is, can your portfolio handle the volatility? Let's try that again. The real question is whether your portfolio can handle the volatility. So that's where a lot of investors get caught. Right now, before I go further, another sip, Cub beer, get it into you. If you're ever in the city at the Cub office and I'm around, you're welcome to join me for one of these. But it's Friday. So imagine two investors. The first investor's built a portfolio that requires everything to go right. Strong growth, low rates, perfect conditions. The second investor has built a portfolio with strong cash flow and financial buffers. Doesn't grow as much. But you know what? When uncertainty arrives, both investors experience the same market. They experience it very differently. One's stressed, the other has a bit of breathing room. One feels pressure every single month, and the other can make rational decisions. That is one of the reasons I talk so much about cash flow, because cash flow, I believe, creates that oxygen. And when you have that financial oxygen, you're less likely to make these emotional decisions during temporary market events. Now, let's move beyond that. Let's take the conversation a step further because, sorry, that was some beer. Let's take this conversation a step further because if we're going to talk about fear, we also need to talk about facts, right? Because if you only consumed headlines over the past 5 years, you'd probably assume that property's been through a terrible period. I mean, sorry, guys, the beer is coming up, right? Think about everything we've had, right? We've had pandemics, we've had rate rise, we've had inflation, we've had affordability concerns, we've had the federal budget changes, political debates, constant commentary. I mean, despite all that, national property values are still up 37.6% over the last 5 years. And that's worth just taking a step back and just sitting with it for a moment, because it highlights the difference between sentiment and reality, right? Sentiment is how people feel. Reality is what's really happening. And those two things don't always move in the same direction, right? In fact, they often move in opposite directions, because I met plenty of investors who were convinced that conditions were terrible. And they look back a few years later and they realize they spent years waiting while the opportunities kept moving right past them. And you know what? There's another number that I believe deserves some real attention. Rental vacancy rates. They're currently sitting, get this, rental vacancy rates are sitting at 1.6%. Pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, they were sitting at 4%, which is already damn low, right? In order to have a sustainable market where you've got enough supply and demand, you really need about 6 to 7% vacancy. They're sitting at 1.6%. That tells us something important. It tells us that demand is strong. People still need places to live, and that supply remains constrained. And my friends, when vacancy gets tight, it creates pressure throughout the system. And that's part of the reason why many experienced investors spend less time watching daily headlines and more time looking at the underlying fundamentals, because the fundamentals tell a story. There's a housing shortage. How do the real investors, now mark my words, the real investors are not asking, oh shit, is this market going to grow? The real investors, I believe, are asking, how do I make hay while the sun shines? We have a housing shortage. How do I make hay out of the housing shortage? How do I create systems which help both alleviate the housing shortage and create a world where I make cash flow and help society at the same time? You know, that's because if you're not asking that kind of question, that's where many people get stuck. They say, that's fine, Gora, I really understand the fundamentals, but I probably want to wait till things settle down. That sounds reasonable, right? Who wouldn't want more certainty? Because we all love certainty. And here's the thing, right? The challenge I find is that confidence tends to return after opportunities have already started moving. The market, my friends, rarely rewards people for waiting until everyone feels comfortable. Now, I need to go have another drink. It is properties and beers because when confidence comes back, because when confidence comes back, competition usually comes back with it. There are more buyers, more activity, more demand, often really higher prices. So if you want to buy an area where there's higher prices, lots of demand, great. Do it at that time. If you want to wait like everyone else. But here's the thing, there's a cost to waiting. This brings us to the final thing I want to discuss tonight, and that is timing, right? Because people say property, location. I want to add something, timing, right? Because that's where most investors get trapped in today's market. You see, because it's not that they make a bad decision. Actually, more than often than not, it's that they never make a decision at all. And my friend Manish Bansal posted this on one of the property forums, and it stuck with me. He said, let me look at what he said, right? He said, remember, the market doesn't send an invitation saying, congratulations, this is the bottom, please buy now. And you know what? Manish is right? Wouldn't life be easier if that's what happened? Imagine opening your inbox. Dear investor, we've officially reached the bottom of the market. Feel free to proceed. It doesn't work that way, right? The reality is that the market bottoms are only obvious after they've happened. And the same applies to opportunities. They're usually much easier to identify in hindsight, right? Hindsight's a beautiful thing, right? And if you're only waiting for the perfect certainty, that can become dangerous because, as Tony Robbins says, certainty is the lowest standard. We often talk about these risks of buying, but we don't spend enough time talking about the risks of waiting. Let's say somebody waits 2 years. Maybe prices rise, maybe rents rise, maybe borrowing power changes, maybe opportunities become more competitive, and maybe price of build actually go up. And the investor still hasn't made a purchase, but the decision was still made. Time kept moving. And that's something that investors sometimes underestimate, the cost of standing still. Now, none of this means you've got to rush into a property right now. Far from it, right? Good investing still requires good due diligence. It requires discipline. It still requires understanding risk really well. But experienced investors, my friends, they generally focus on preparing for different outcomes rather than trying to predict every single outcome. They focus on the things they can control. Cash flow, buffers, asset quality, demand, portfolio sustainability, and optionality. Because look, if your portfolio can handle all these different conditions, you don't need perfect forecasts. You don't need permanent sunshine. You don't need government policy, every single government policy to go on your way. You don't need economic prediction to be accurate. And your portfolio can continue functioning while the world argues about what's coming next. And my friends, I've been talking about this for a while. In reality, that's what an all-weather portfolio is about, right? And Luke, I agree. It's a sad state of affairs right now, right? You know, this is why we created the all-weather portfolio. That's a portfolio we've been building our clients for over a decade now. Having enough resilience that you're not constantly dependent on ideal conditions, right? Having enough income that you can hold quality assets throughout the uncertainty. Having enough flexibility that opportunities can be acted on when they appear. So, my friends, if I could leave you one thought tonight, I'm going to have a beer. I'm going to leave you with one thought tonight. It's this. The structure of your portfolio is crucial. And it's often the part that investors have the most control over. Now, before we wrap up, I've got some good news. A lot of people have asked us questions recently about our all-weather property portfolios. How do they work? What does it look like for ones in practice? How do you build a portfolio that continues performing while interest rates move, government change policies, or market conditions become less predictable? That, my friends, is exactly why we're running a really special webinar. We've got the TLDR webinar. That's right, too long didn't read. We created a webinar with that. And, you know, my friend Ryan Specavento the other day, shout out to Ryan if you're watching this. He said, Gora, your webinars are too long. I'm sure you've got amazing value. When I showed them some of the properties, he's like, geez, I wish I knew about this earlier. I'm like, why didn't you do it? He said, your webinars are too long. And I said, you know what? We need a TLDR, too long didn't read webinar. And the reason for that name is that, right? Most people don't have like 2 or 3 hours to sit through a webinar anymore. So we've condensed it into 30 minutes, right? It's designed for busy people who are actually serious about understanding their all-weather portfolios, how they work, and why more investors are moving towards cash flow focused assets rather than relying purely on growth. So we're also going to be showing real examples of how properties generate between 78 to 250K a year in positive cash flow, and discuss tonight how these assets can create the financial oxygen we've been talking about tonight, right? So if you've been sitting there wondering how to build a portfolio that can handle different market conditions, I think you'll get a lot out of it. So we've still got some spots available for June 17th. If you'd like to join us, keep an eye out on our page for the Rego details, and I'm going to post them in the chat soon. And while you're there, make sure you're following Ethical Property Investments on Facebook and Insta. A surprising number of people watch these live streams every single week but haven't followed our page yet, which means you're probably missing out on market updates, educational content, investor stories, and the conversations we share between these properties and beers. So hit follow, stay connected, and we'll keep bringing you the awesome information that helps you turn ideas into reality to become a better investor in the long term. Now, my friends, thank you for spending the last 15 minutes of your evening with me. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you on the next Properties and Beers. Guys, cheers and have a fantastic weekend.